In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told, stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories. The accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that change the world. Let us begin by travelling into a past long forgotten yet still echoing into our present. For many, the word Vietnam brings to mind a long war. Yet the Vietnamese story stretches back thousands of years. It is a tale of constant struggle for freedom against great odds. Today we look beyond recent conflicts to the full sweep of this story. From legendary beginnings to the world we know now, the origins of Vietnam start not with records or ruins, but with magic. A cherished myth of a dragon lord and a fairy princess. Before written history, their tale emerged. Lac Long Quan ruled the waters and coasts. O Ko lived in the northern highlands. Their meeting was more than a union of two beings. It married the two essential parts of the land, the mountains and the sea. From their legendary love came 100 sons. This myth created a single ancestry for all Vietnamese people. Their separation was peaceful. 50 sons went to the coast with their father. 50 went to the highlands with their mother. They remained connected as one family. This story foreshadowed regional differences within a shared identity. Today, Vietnamese call themselves children of the dragon and fairy. This is more than folklore. It affirms an identity that existed before foreign influence. This idea carries deep emotional weight. It roots their identity in a myth outside of later Chinese cultural reach. The myth lives on at the Hung Temple in Pu Tho. Annual ceremonies honour the Hung kings said to be direct descendants. Thousands gather for rituals unchanged for centuries. This connects modern people to mythical ancestors through living tradition. Beneath the story, the myth hints at real ancient social structures. The importance of O Ko may reflect early matrilineal ways. The dragon and fairy may represent merging tribal groups. Archaeology in the Red River Delta shows early bronze cultures. These may be the real people behind the myth. Leaders have long invoked this shared ancestry to unite the nation. During the American War, propaganda reminded people of their dragon fairy spirit. The myth became a tool to strengthen identity when independence was threatened. The number 100 also holds meaning. In East Asian thought, it means completeness and perfection. Descent from 100 children includes every Vietnamese person in the national family beyond myths. Physical evidence of ancient skill lies in the earth. Bronze drums once sounded across the landscape. The legendary 100 Sons evolved into tribal groups. These groups formed the Dong Sun culture. This Bronze Age society thrived long before written records. Their most striking achievement was the bronze drum. These were not simple instruments. They were complex ceremonial objects. Making them required great metalworking skill. Artisans used the lost wax casting method. The finest drums weigh over 100 kilograms. They served many purposes in Dongson society. Their sound called people to gatherings and ceremonies. In war, they coordinated troops over distance. Chiefs owned the most elaborate drums as symbols of power. Decorations on the drums show us prehistoric life scenes, depict warriors in boats, and shamans in ritual. Farmers harvest rice, and musicians play. Birds like egrets appear often perhaps as spirit messengers. These images reveal a complex society with clear social order. The Dongsun people were skilled in more than metal. They practiced advanced wet rice farming with buffalo and irrigation. They built houses on stilts visible in drum art and confirmed by archaeology. They made fine jewellery, weapons and tools showing mastery of materials. Dongsun influence reached beyond northern Vietnam. Finds suggest connections to southern China, Laos and Cambodia. Dongsun drums have been found in Indonesia and Malaysia. This shows ancient maritime trade networks. One drum was even found in South India. This points to trade spanning vast distances. Dongsun society was likely led by powerful chiefs. These chiefs may be the legendary Hung kings of later tradition. They controlled village confederations through kinship and alliance. Their advanced culture suggests complex political organization. The Dongsun culture is a crucial bridge between myth and history. Chinese records later called the region primitive, but archaeology reveals a society advanced in technology and art. It developed independently for centuries before foreign contact. As Bronze Age society matured, the landscape changed. Around 258 BCE, a mountain chief named Thuc Phan united tribes. He formed Vietnam's first true centralized state called Ao Lac. He took the title King Nduong Vuong. His rule was more than a tribal confederation. He built a state with administration and borders. This was a revolutionary shift in political organization. King Nduong Vuong focused strongly on defense. Facing threats from the Qin dynasty in China, he needed innovation. His solution was the Ko Loa Citadel, an engineering marvel. Near modern Hanoi, its walls stood 12 meters high. The design resembled a snail shell for maximum defense. Building it required thousands of workers over years. Excavations at Ko Loa show the technologic skill of Ao Lac. Tens of thousands of bronze arrowheads have been found. Many were still in their molds, suggesting mass production. This points to a society able to organize specialized labor. But history and legend soon intertwined in Ao Lac folklore. Says a golden turtle spirit helped the king build Ko Loa. The spirit gave him a magic crossbow that could kill thousands. This weapon appears often in Vietnamese texts, blending fact and myth. Ao Lac did not last long. It fell around 179 BCE through betrayal and conquest. As the story goes, the king's daughter Mi Chao fell in love with a rival's son. He tricked her, discovered the crossbow's secret, and sabotaged it. This allowed his father's armies to conquer the kingdom. The tale of Mi Chao's betrayal is a national lesson about trust and foreign threats. In poetic versions, the king beheads his daughter, then rides his horse into the sea. Her lover finds her body overcome with remorse and drowns himself. Where her blood touched the ocean, it is said pearls formed. With Ao Lac's fall, the region was absorbed into a larger kingdom. Though under foreign rule, the Vietnamese kept their cultural distinctness. This set a pattern of adapting to conquest while preserving identity. This period foreshadowed a much longer era of foreign control. In 111 BCE, Han Dynasty armies swept through the region. They established direct imperial rule. This began nearly 1,000 years of Chinese political domination. The Han divided the land into commanderies and prefectures. They imposed a Chinese bureaucracy reporting to the imperial court. Chinese officials implemented policies to transform local culture. Examination systems tested knowledge of Chinese classics. Vietnamese elites had to study Confucian texts for influence. The commandery of Jiaoqi was the Han Empire's southern frontier. Here Chinese officials could prove themselves for better posts. While governing from new centres, they faced persistent local resistance. Chinese records note many rebellions over the centuries. Each was crushed, but each showed a refusal to accept permanent rule. The empire used sophisticated methods of cultural change. They regulated marriage and enforced patriarchal family structures. They mandated changes in clothing hairstyles and rituals. Chinese-style buildings replaced local architecture. Most significantly, they introduced Chinese writing and administrative terms. These remain part of the Vietnamese language today. Yet beneath this surface, Vietnamese village life continued local religious practices blended with imported beliefs. Village councils kept traditional ways under Chinese administration. Women kept important economic roles despite Confucian ideas. Archaeology shows this quiet resistance burial sites mix Chinese objects and indigenous symbols. Pottery keeps Vietnamese decorative patterns, diet preserves local culinary traditions. Buddhism arrived during this time and took root. It came via sea routes from India around the 2nd century CE. Vietnamese Buddhism blended with older animistic beliefs. It emphasized practical benefits and harmony with local spirit ways. At Lui Lao near Hanoi, an early Buddhist center flourished. It created a unique spiritual blend central to later national identity. Chinese technology transformed farming. Better irrigation, metal plows, and water systems increased rice yields. Chinese astronomy helped predict seasons. Mathematics improved record keeping. These tools were embraced even as cultural assimilation was resisted. By the 5th century CE, a hybrid elite emerged, ethnically Vietnamese, but educated in Chinese classics, fluent in Chinese, but connected to local culture. These scholar officials navigated dual identities. They used Chinese political ideas to express Vietnamese aspirations. This pattern would help later independence movements. The long occupation created a complex legacy. Vietnam emerged with strong Chinese cultural influences, from government to literature, philosophy to farming techniques, yet resistance to foreign rule forged a powerful sense of Vietnamese identity. They adopted Chinese tools but kept their essence. This pattern of adaptation without surrender would serve them for centuries. In 40 CE, 2 sisters did the impossible. They overthrew the mighty Han Empire and established an independent state ruled by women. The uprising began with personal tragedy. Chinese officials executed the husband of Trung Trak for protest. The grieving widow turned her mourning into revolution. With her sister Trung Nahai, she rallied local nobles tired of Han taxes and cultural erasure. Their leadership brought an overwhelming response. Their army grew to tens of thousands, including many female officers. They led forces riding war elephants, unnerving their opponents. They captured 65 fortified cities within months. This shocked Han authorities, who saw it as a minor disturbance. After driving out the Chinese, Trung Trak was declared queen. Her 3-year reign challenged the Confucian order the Han imposed. She established her capital at her hometown Milin. This emphasized the local character of her government. Emperor Guangwu of the Han finally sent a veteran general, Ma Yuan. The Chinese counterattack was devastating. Better equipped and greater in number, they pushed back the resistance. After final defeat in 43 CE, the sisters drowned themselves in a river. They chose death over capture. Their deaths became as symbolic as their lives. Though the rebellion failed, its significance was immense. Han records devoted unusual attention to this revolt. They noted both its scale and the embarrassment it caused. They specifically mentioned the gender of the leaders troubled by the challenge. The Trung sisters' legacy grew over centuries. They evolved from historical figures to national icons. Temples dedicated to them appeared throughout Vietnam. Annual ceremonies on their death anniversary became acts of patriotism. They set a precedent for women's leadership in resistance. Later, female warriors were often compared to the Trung sisters. This created a distinct tradition rare in East Asian history. For almost 900 more years, Vietnam stayed under Chinese control. Then in 938 CE, one commander devised a brilliant trap. The architect was Ngo Quyen, a military governor. He saw the decline of Tang Dynasty power in China. A southern Han state now bordered Vietnam and sought control. Ngo Quyen prepared for a confrontation that would decide Vietnam's fate. His opponent Liu Hongkao commanded a fleet sailing toward the Red River Delta. Ngo Quyen did not meet the superior force head-on. He studied the tide patterns of the Bac Dang River. He ordered his men to plant iron-tipped wooden stakes in the riverbed at low tide. The The stakes stayed hidden when the tide rose. Vietnamese forces lured the Southern Han fleet into the estuary as the tide went out. The massive warships were impaled and immobilised Vietnamese soldiers, then launched a devastating ambush, destroying the fleet. The Southern Han commander was killed. This victory marked the first great assertion of Vietnamese independence. This clever use of terrain and timing would be repeated twice more in history. After victory, Ngo Quyen declared himself king. He established his capital at Co Loa, linking his rule to ancient O Lac. He laid foundations for a sovereign Vietnamese state for the first time in nearly a millennium. Vietnam was ruled by a Vietnamese monarch. His triumph was more than military victory. It was a profound psychological turning point. The cycle of domination was broken. The myth of Chinese military superiority was shattered. Though his reign lasted only 6 years, he is venerated as the architect of independence. The period after his death saw power struggles among warlords. But the precedent of self-rule was set. The Bac Dang River tactic would echo through history. In 981, Emperor Le Huan used it against Song dynasty invaders. Most famously, in 1288, General Tran Hung Dao repeated it against Kublai Khan's Mongol fleet. That battle ended Mongol attempts to conquer Vietnam. Military victories preserved independence, but building a civilization was different. In 1009, a Buddhist monk named Li Kongwan took the throne. He became Emperor Li Tai. To founding a dynasty that unified and shaped Vietnam, he moved the capital from a defensive mountain site to a marshy area along the Red River. Chinese geomancers said this spot had dragon-rising energy. He established Thang, long-ascending dragon, later. Hanoi moving the capital was a symbolic declaration of Vietnamese confidence. The emperor stated, "The capital is where heaven and earth meet." This showed a vision of permanence and centrality, not just defence under the Li emperors. Buddhism flourished. Emperor Li Tai Tong composed Buddhist texts and led ceremonies. His son Li Tan Tong built the famous one-pillar pagoda shaped like a lotus. This was nation-building through spiritual means. Buddhist monks served as royal advisors on diplomacy and military campaigns. Imperial examinations began during this period. They tested Confucian classics, but also Buddhist texts and local traditions. This created a unique Vietnamese intellectual tradition. The one-pillar pagoda was a site for these exams, linking spiritual and secular authority. The Lai dynasty had a revolutionary approach to governance. Emperor Li Tan Tong instituted Vietnam's first comprehensive legal code. In 1042, it tempered Chinese-influenced laws with Buddhist compassion. When asked why he reduced penalties, he said, "I would rather spare a guilty person than kill an innocent one." This reflected Buddhist influence, not Confucian strictness. The Li emperors transformed the landscape. They built dikes along the Red River, enabling farming to flourish. This was a Vietnamese approach to working with the monsoon environment. Court records say Emperor Li Tai Tong inspected dike construction during rains. Cultural achievements matched political innovations. The dynasty built the Temple of Literature. Van Muir in 1070, Vietnam's first university. Even this Confucian institution had Vietnamese elements. Carvings showed local plants, animals and Buddhist symbols. The arts flourished with bronze casting reaching new heights. The Phat Tik Pagoda Buddha, cast in 1057, blended Chinese technique with Southeast Asian features. The Li dynasty's 2 centuries established lasting patterns, a blend of Chinese administration with indigenous traditions. A spiritual base in Buddhism tempered by practical Confucian ethics, confidence in Vietnam's ability to stand as an independent nation with its own identity. This confidence would soon face its ultimate test. While most empires fell to the Mongols, Vietnam achieved the impossible. They defeated Kublai Khan's armies 3 times through tactical genius and environmental warfare. The Tran dynasty came to power in 1225. They maintained extensive family involvement in governance. Military innovation became their hallmark for good reason. By the 1250s, Mongol armies had conquered China, Korea, Central Asia, and parts of Europe. Their empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Few expected the small kingdom of Dai Viet to survive their attention. The first invasion in 1257 caught Vietnam unprepared. Mongol forces captured Thang Long, forcing the court to flee. But the Vietnamese regrouped. Emperor Tran Tai Tong and General Tran Thu Du used a scorched earth policy. They destroyed food supplies and poisoned wells. The Mongols, used to living off conquered land, faced starvation and disease. Within months, they withdrew with no lasting conquest. The second invasion in 1284-85 showed the brilliance of Prince Tran Hung Dao. He became Vietnam's most celebrated military commander. He did not confront the larger Mongol force directly. He used asymmetric warfare. Vietnamese forces abandoned cities, lured enemies into unfamiliar terrain. They struck with quick ambushes, then vanished into forests and swamps. They drew Mongol troops into malarial swamps where disease decimated their ranks. Mongol cavalry, unstoppable on plains, was neutralized in Vietnam's jungles and flooded rice fields. Their recurved bows lost tension in the humid climate. The third invasion in 1287-88 was Kublai Khan's most determined effort. A massive fleet with over 300,000 soldiers sailed toward Dai Viet Tran. Hung Dao orchestrated the decisive victory at the Bac Dang River. Using the same technique as Ngo Quyen, they planted stakes underwater at low tide. When the Mongol fleet pursued what seemed a retreating navy, their ships were impaled. As the tide fell, Vietnamese forces launched a devastating counterattack, destroying the fleet and killing the Mongol commander. Beyond military wins, the Tran dynasty made practical reforms. They created a revolving land ownership system. Fields were periodically redistributed. This prevented aristocrats from amassing too much wealth and power. Imperial exams were reformed to include more practical subjects. The dynasty promoted a Vietnamese form of Buddhism blended with local beliefs. Emperor Tran Nan Tong abdicated to become a monk, founding the Truc Lam Zen school. Yet this period also saw more Confucian influence in government, creating a unique balance. This spiritual political harmony eventually gave way to decline. This created an opening for an ambitious official to seize power. Ho Qui Lis reforms might seem progressive now, but in the 15th century they triggered disaster. By the late 1300s, the Tran dynasty was decaying. Court intrigue spread corruption, and the land system failed. Ho Kui Lie, a high-ranking mandarin who married into the royal family, stepped into the vacuum. He engineered a takeover, forcing the last Tran emperor to abdicate in 1400. He proclaimed a new dynasty and launched ambitious reforms. He cut the power of Buddhist institutions, taking their wealth for the state. He redistributed land, limiting aristocratic holdings and giving excess to peasants. He introduced Vietnam's first paper currency and state monopolies on salt and iron. He even created government-run pawn shops, an early public banking form. Perhaps most remarkably, he innovated in education. He created public schools open to commoners, not just elites. He added new subjects like mathematics to state exams, a radical change. He personally translated Chinese classics into Chu Nom, an early Vietnamese script. He downgraded the importance of studying Chinese language. But revolution from above often brings resistance from below. Buddhist monks resented lost status. Landlords hated property, confiscation. Merchants chafed under new rules. Scholars scorned exam changes. Commoners struggled with paper money, which quickly lost value. With Vietnam divided, the Ming dynasty of China saw its chance when Ho Qui Ly renamed the country Dai Ninggu and gave power to his son Ming, launched an invasion. They claimed to restore the Tran dynasty, but really wanted annexation. Internal tensions made resistance weak. Within months, Ho and his son were captured and sent to die in exile. The Ming occupation that followed was especially harsh. They pursued complete cultural assimilation. They renamed the region Jiaoqi Province under direct Chinese control. They confiscated Vietnamese historical texts, shipping over 10,000 books to China. They forced Vietnamese to adopt Chinese clothing hairstyles and marriage customs. They sent tens of thousands of Vietnamese craftsmen, scholars and artists to China. This deprived Vietnam of its cultural elite. The Ming systematically erased Vietnamese written culture. They banned Chu Nom script, requiring all documents in Chinese. They destroyed native texts and punished those who kept them. This assault on language created a cultural trauma fueling resistance for generations. But the Ming overlooked how occupation would unite a divided people. From cultural destruction rose not just a rebellion, but a sophisticated 10-year campaign. It combined guerrilla war, psychological tactics, and perhaps history's earliest documented nationalist movement. In 1418, a minor landowner named Le Loi gathered just 27 followers at Lam Son Mountain. This modest start led to Vietnam's most successful liberation movement. Unlike earlier rebellions, Le Loi used patience. He built bases in remote highlands and slowly expanded control. For 5 years, his forces avoided major battles. They targeted supply lines, isolated garrisons and collaborators. Ming armies designed for conventional war were frustrated. Le Loi forces melted into jungles and mountains when pursued. They used Vietnam's challenging geography as a weapon. Monsoon climate, dense forests, rugged mountains all worked against Ming troops. Equally revolutionary was the propaganda campaign by Le Loi strategist Nguyen Trai. He wrote proclamations addressing both Vietnamese supporters and Ming soldiers. His masterpiece, Bin Gu Dai Sao, articulated a moral justification for resistance. It argued for Vietnamese cultural and political independence. Our people long ago established sovereignty over the mountains and rivers of the south, he wrote, just as north and south have different customs, the Viet and Han have different kings. This was a modern idea of nationhood based on shared territory history and cultural difference. By 1426, as Ming reinforcements dwindled and local support surged, the tide turned. After a big Vietnamese victory at Chi Lang Pass, the Chinese emperor agreed to talks. In late 1427, the last Ming forces withdrew. In 1428, Le Loi became Emperor Le Tai to founding the later Le dynasty. After liberation, the Le dynasty enacted sweeping reforms. Le Loi redistributed land taken from Ming collaborators to supporters and peasants. He reorganized administration into a 6-level hierarchy from province to village. Under his successors, especially Emperor Le Tan Tong, 1460-1497, the dynasty peaked. The comprehensive Hong Duke legal code had 722 articles. It covered family relations and commerce. Notably, it gave women unprecedented rights to own property, seek divorce, and join family decisions. These rights were largely absent in Chinese law. Then, the dynasty launched big infrastructure projects. They built road networks connecting provinces and canals. Expanding farming civil service exams returned with changes, stressing practical knowledge alongside Confucian classics. This produced scholar officials loyal to Vietnamese traditions, not Chinese models. Confucian thought became the dominant framework under the later Li exams expanded, creating a meritocratic elite from all society. Success in exams could elevate commoners to high office. The Temple of Literature in Hanoi symbolized deep reverence for education. Stone stelae, they're engraved with graduate names, still stand today. They mark a tradition blending Chinese classics with Vietnamese values. As Confucianism spread, women's rights gradually contracted. Buddhism lost official patronage. Ancestral worship became more rigid. This period solidified a uniquely Vietnamese bureaucracy. It was rooted in Chinese models but shaped by local reality. It endured long after the Dynasties' fall. Confucian thought reshaped gender roles and family life. The three submissions doctrine required women to obey father, husband, then son. The Hong Duc Code kept some property rights for women, but patriarchal authority grew. Ancestral worship became formal with rituals following Confucian principles. Buddhism, once a spiritual cornerstone, retreated to a popular faith. Monasteries lost royal patronage. Confucian temples got imperial support. Scholars wrote on governance and morality, not spiritual matters. By the 1500s, Vietnamese political discourse occurred within a Confucian framework. Literacy stayed mostly with the elite educated in classical Chinese. The Chunom script let a parallel literary tradition grow. Officials wrote formal documents in Chinese, but poetry and personal letters in none. This reflected Vietnam's complex cultural identity. For nearly 1,000 years, a process called Nam Tien, the march south, transformed Vietnam. It changed a compact trade river delta kingdom into the long, slender country we know. Beginning around the 11th century, rulers looked south. The main obstacle was Kampo, a maritime kingdom, with ties to India and Indonesia. The Chams built brick towers for Hindu gods along the central coast. Their society thrived on sea trade, connecting across Southeast Asia. Vietnamese expansion was not just military. It happened through gradual settlement. Vietnamese farmers moved south, establishing villages based on Confucian principles and rice farming. These settlements slowly changed the landscape physically and culturally. Demographic pressure pushed the Vietnamese frontier deeper into Cham land. Conflict waxed and waned over centuries. Vietnamese records note many campaigns against Kampo. But reality was more complex, with intermarriage and trade creating hybrid border cultures. The decisive turn came in 1471. Emperor Lithan Tong launched a massive invasion of Kampo. His forces captured and destroyed Vijoy, the Cham capital. Kampo never recovered as a unified state. Remaining territories fragmented and fell one by one to Vietnamese control. Vietnamese settlers transformed former Cham lands. They introduced wet rice farming techniques from the north. They built irrigation systems and terrace fields. Village governance based on northern models created linked communities. Expansion did not stop at Kampo. By the 1600 seconds and 1700 seconds, settlers reached the Mekong Delta, historically controlled by the Khmer Empire. The fertile delta could support multiple rice crops yearly. It became the new frontier. Settlers drained swamps, dug canals, and established a plantation economy. The region became Vietnam's rice bowl. Nam Tien had profound cultural impact. As territory expanded, it incorporated diverse ethnic groups with their own languages and religions. Highland peoples like the Eden Jara found themselves surrounded by Vietnamese settlements. The Cham, once dominant on the central coast, became a minority in their ancestral lands. Today, Vietnamese Cham communities keep distinct practices, including forms of Islam and Hinduism. Physical remnants of this history dot central and southern Vietnam. The My Sun Temple complex with its brick towers is a UNESCO site. It shows Cham architectural genius. In Binh Thuan and Ninh Thuan provinces, Cham communities maintain temples and rituals. The legacy of Nam Tien goes beyond territory. It shaped Vietnamese identity, creating a country spanning diverse ecological zones. It set patterns of migration and cultural adaptation that continued into modern times. While the country expanded south, a deep political division split Vietnam into rival domains. This created a paradox of unity and division, shaping the future for generations. In 1627, the Gionach River in Quang Binh province divided north and south. The Trinh lords ruled the north from Thang Long, Hanoi. The Nguyen lords ruled the south from Phu Xuan Hieu. Both factions technically served the late emperor in the north. but the emperor became a ceremonial figurehead with no real power. The division was not just administrative. Between 1627 and 1670, the rival lords fought 7 major campaigns. Central Vietnam became a battlefield. The Nguyen, with less land, proved resilient against stronger Trinh forces. After decades of fighting, both sides accepted a stalemate. This began one of history's longest-running Cold Wars. The Nguyen did not rely on their military might. They built an impressive defensive network. The Dong Hoi Wall was a massive fortification stretching nearly 20 kilometers. It had earthen ramparts, deep moats, and strategic forts. Portuguese engineers helped design parts of this Vietnamese Great Wall. It blended Eastern and Western military ideas. Archaeology has found remnants of this wall hidden in jungle growth. The long separation changed Vietnamese culture and society. The northern Trinh domain kept stronger ties to Confucian tradition. It emphasized a conservative scholar-bureaucrat system. Court exams, rituals, and formality characterized northern governance. The southern Nguyen lands developed a more pragmatic commercial society. They kept expanding into former shamaned Khmer lands. The Nguyen lords cultivated international trade. Japanese and Chinese merchants settled in southern ports. European powers, first Portuguese and Dutch, later French, brought new tech, weapons, and ideas. Christian missionaries found more tolerance in the south, converting thousands. By the early 1700s, cultural differences between north and south were pronounced. Visitors described them almost as separate countries. Paradoxically, both regimes had periods of stability and prosperity. The Trinh maintained administration in the dense Red River Delta. The Nguyen developed new farmland and trade networks in central and south Vietnam. Literary culture flourished in both regions with distinct northern and southern styles. Vietnam literature written in adapted Chinese script preserved Vietnamese cultural expressions, but the stalemate eventually cost both societies. Military spending drained resources, corruption grew, peasant taxes rose. Sporadic uprisings occurred. By the mid-1700s, both Trinh and Nguyen were detached from common people's concerns. They focused on court intrigue and keeping regional power. This dissatisfaction created fertile ground for revolution, especially in central regions most affected by division. From this came Vietnam's most unexpected heroes. 3 brothers from the mountain village of Tay Son, who went from tax collectors to revolutionaries. The brothers Nguyen and Nguyen. Huyen Nguyen Lu had humble origins, but remarkable talent. Their uprising was not just another rebellion. It was when common people seized control after generations of oppression. The revolt began in 1771 against corrupt officials in central Vietnam. At first, they targeted local tax collectors, but peasants flocked to their cause quickly. The brothers harnessed widespread discontent. They presented themselves as champions of the poor against feudal exploitation. Their message was simple: the current order had failed ordinary Vietnamese. Within a few years, Tay Son forces did the impossible. In 1773, they captured Quai Nh, establishing their first power base. By 1777, they overthrew the southern Nguyen regime, executing most of the royal family. Then in 1786, Nguyen, he led his army north, capturing Hanoi, toppling the Trinh. For the first time in 150 years, Vietnam was unified under one authority. The middle brother Nguyen, he was the movement's military genius. A brilliant tactician, he defeated larger, better equipped forces with innovative tactics. His soldiers, many former peasants, were fiercely loyal. They saw him as both commander and spiritual leader destined to restore justice. After taking control, the eldest brother, Nguyen Na, proclaimed himself emperor. He tried to start a new dynasty, but tensions rose among the brothers over dividing territories. Internal conflict stopped them from consolidating rule and making lasting reforms. The movement faced its greatest challenge in 1788. Emperor Qianlong of China sent a massive invasion force of 200,000 soldiers. They aimed to restore the dynasty as a Chinese vassal state. King Armei quickly occupied Hanoi, seemingly ending Tay-Sun control in the north. In response, Nguyen crowned himself Emperor Quang Trung. He prepared a desperate counterattack. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary military campaign in Vietnamese history. Emperor Quang Trung gathered 100,000 troops. He marched north during Lunar Year, covering 600 kilometers in just 10 days. While Chinese forces celebrated Tet in Hanoi, his army launched surprise attacks. They fought at night, used impassable terrain and deployed war elephants. Within 6 days, they routed the King Army, recaptured Hanoi and forced a humiliating retreat. Once in power, the Tay-Sun implemented significant reform. They broke with traditional Confucian governance. They redistributed land taken from large owners to poor farmers. They simplified writing using the more accessible non-script for government business. They reduced taxes for ordinary people and promoted trade in neglected regions. Unlike earlier dynasties, the Tay-Sun valued practical skills and military prowess. They promoted talent regardless of background, creating new social mobility. Their court blended Buddhist, Taoist, and folk elements, appealing to ordinary Vietnamese. But the Tay-Sun regime did not last long. Emperor Quang Trung died in 1792 at just 40 years old. This deprived the movement of its most capable leader. Meanwhile, Nguyen and the sole survivor of the southern Nguyen family had escaped to Siam. He built a resistance movement with Europeans, support especially from French missionaries. The death of Quang Trung created a power vacuum. It would be filled by the most unlikely candidate, a man who spent decades as a fugitive. Nguyen, NH's journey from exile to founding emperor, is one of history's great comebacks. His persistence was legendary. After fleeing Tay-Sun forces, he built alliances in Cambodia and Siam. He recruited mercenaries and slowly reclaimed territory through guerrilla campaigns along the southern coast. The turning point came when Nguyen allied with French missionary Pig and Eau de Behane. The bishop went to Versailles in 1787, securing a treaty promising French military support for trade privileges. King Louis XVI, I never fully acted due to the French Revolution, but Pig No independently recruited French engineers, officers and arms suppliers. They modernized Nguyen and HS forces decisively. By 1801, Nguyen recaptured Hue. The next year his armies took Hanoi, ending the Tay-Sun era. In a symbolic ceremony, Nguyen proclaimed himself Emperor Ji along. He combined names of ancient capitals Jiad in Saigon and Thang Lo Hanoi. He founded the Nguyen dynasty, ruling until 1945. One significant act was his official adoption of the name Vietnam for the unified country. Previously it was called Dai Viet or Dong Trong Dam Go Dini during division. This new name reflected a unified identity, acknowledging ancient heritage and new reality. The King Court in China formally recognized this name, a diplomatic win for Vietnamese sovereignty. The early Nguyen period reorganized governance dramatically. The country split into 26 provinces with standardized administration. A comprehensive census happened, a new tax system started. Emperor Ji long ordered the Ji, a long code of 398 chapter legal document. It blended Vietnamese customary law with Chinese-inspired Confucian principles. This created a unified legal framework for decades. On the Ji along's direction, physical infrastructure expanded. Engineers built the Mandarin Road, a highway connecting Hanoi to Saigon. It helped troop movements and commerce. A complex canal network was dug throughout the Mekong Delta, for transport and irrigation. These projects needed massive labor, but created lasting economic system. The most visible symbol of the new dynasty was the imperial city of Hue. Construction began in 1804. This massive complex covered over 500 hectares. It took thousands of workers nearly 30 years to finish. Modeled after Beijing's Forbidden City, it had Vietnamese elements. It was oriented by geomantic principles with the Perfume River before it and Dengu Bin Mountain behind. The complex had over 100 pavilions, temples and palaces. A 10-meter-high wand moat over 30 meters wide surrounded it. Despite these achievements, seeds of future conflict were planted. Emperor Ji, a long-sunned successor, then Mang intensified Confucian orthodoxy. He grew suspicious of Western influence. Catholic missionaries, once allies of his father, faced restrictions then persecution. This cultural conservatism extended to trade. The Nguyen court rejected European commercial overtures, just as Western imperial ambitions in Asia grew. This rejection meant to protect sovereignty would ironically become the Dynasties' fatal mistake. Within decades, the Empire Ji, a long-built, faced an existential threat. It came with advanced weapons, industrial might and colonial ambitions no Confucian tradition could withstand. France's imperial designs on Vietnam began in earnest in 1858 with a naval attack on Da Nang. Justified as protecting persecuted Catholics, France's true motives were pragmatic. They wanted commercial footholds in Asia's strategic ports for their navy and new markets for French goods. Napoleon I saw Vietnam as a gateway to southern China's lucrative markets. The conquest followed a methodical pattern. Starting with Saigon in 1859, French forces carved out southern Vietnam, Cochin China, as their first colony by 1867. The strategy combined overwhelming firepower, steam warships, and modern artillery with diplomatic manipulation. Cambodia was forced into being a protectorate in 1863, isolating Vietnam further. Emperor Tuduk, ruling 1840-1880, epitomized the Nguyen dynasty's tragic paradox. A scholarly ruler and poet, he saw the French threat but stayed trapped in traditional thinking. His court split between modernizers wanting defensive adaptation and conservatives rejecting all Western ideas as corrupting. The emperor ultimately chose tradition. He refused to reform Vietnamese military or governance as province after province fell. The French secured northern Vietnam through treaties in the 1872 and 1882. The Treaty of Saigon 1874 opened Red River ports to foreign trade. The Treaty of Hue 1883, signed after French warships bombarded coastal defenses, made a protectorate over North and Central Vietnam. These agreements, forced under threat, formalized loss of sovereignty, while keeping a facade of royal authority. By 1885, resistance from the imperial court peaked. Emperor Ham Nghi fled the palace and issued the Can Vuong Edict. It called on Vietnamese to aid the king against French occupation. This document urged loyal subjects to use guerrilla warfare against colonial forces. Regional scholars and local officials led resistance bands in mountains and rural areas. They launched attacks on French garrisons. The French response was brutal. Villagers suspected of helping resistance were burned, crops destroyed, civilians executed. Capture meant prison, exile, or death. By 1896, most major Can Vuong leaders were captured or killed, though isolated resistance continued into the early 1900s. French colonial administration transformed Vietnamese society profoundly. The country split into 3 distinct regions. Cochin China became a direct colony with French citizenship laws. Annam and Tonkin became protectorates with indirect rule through Vietnamese officials, supervised by French residents. This fragmentation was deliberate to prevent unified nationalist sentiment. Economic exploitation became systematic. Vast fertile land was seized for French-owned rubber, coffee and tea plantations. The traditional village economy was disrupted by new tax systems forcing peasants to grow cash crops. Government monopolies on alcohol, salt and opium, essentials in Vietnamese life, made huge revenues for colonial coffers, impoverishing local. The physical landscape changed dramatically. Infrastructure projects served colonial interests. Railways connected mining regions to ports, helping resource extraction. Colonial architecture transformed urban centers, especially Hanoi and Saigon. French-style boulevards, administrative buildings, and villas created European enclaves amid Vietnamese neighborhoods. Colonial cities showed imperial modernity, but also symbolized the racial and cultural divide at the heart of French rule. French education meant to produce loyal subjects, instead nurtured Vietnamese intellectuals who questioned empire. These contradictions would fuel the next wave of resistance. It would be led not just by soldiers or peasants, but by poets, scholars, and revolutionaries. While the French perfected colonial control, a young Vietnamese man traveled the world. He worked as a ship's cook, a hotel dishwasher, a photographer's assistant, all while assembling a revolutionary blueprint that would shatter French Indochina. His name was Nguyen Sinh Cung, but history remembers him by another name. Born in 1890 in Gian Province, he grew up seeing colonial contradictions. In 1911, he began a remarkable global odyssey. It transformed him from a provincial youth into an international revolutionary. Taking the name Nguyen, Quoc Nguyen, the patriot, he worked odd jobs on cargo ships. He visited ports across Africa, America, and Europe. He saw European imperialism mess reach and resistance stirrings against it. By 1917, he settled in Paris, imperial capital of the power ruling his homeland. There he found work retouching photos while diving into radical political circles. Paris was his classroom for revolutionary theory. He read Marx and Lenin and connected with anti-colonial activists from across the French Empire. In 1919, at the Versailles Peace Conference, he wrote an 8-point petition for Vietnamese self-determination. Wearing a rented Western suit, he tried to give it to President Woodrow Wilson, whose 14 points promised self-determination to European peoples. The petition was ignored, teaching a harsh lesson: Western democratic ideals were not for Asian colonies. This rejection pushed him toward revolutionary socialism. In 1920, at the Congress of Tours, he helped found the French Communist Party. He believed Marxism-Leninism offered the best framework for national liberation. It was patriotism, not communism, that originally inspired me, he later said. But studying Marx convinced me only socialism and communism could liberate oppressed nations. Through the 1922, he traveled to Moscow for training, then to China, working with Chinese revolutionaries. Now using the name Ho Chi Minh, he who enlightens, he organized Vietnamese exiles. He published revolutionary journals and trained cadres in Marxist theory adapted to Vietnamese conditions. His key achievement came in February 1930. He orchestrated merging communist factions into the Indochinese Communist Party, ICP. Unlike early resistance, the ICP combined political organization with deep roots among peasants and urban workers. The party's founding program called for overthrowing French imperialism, Vietnamese independence, confiscating colonial oaths, land, and an 8-hour workday. These demands spoke to both nationalist and class grievances. Meanwhile, other nationalist currents flowed. The Vietnam Quoc and Anh Vien Udd modeled on China's Kuo Intang, drew intellectuals and civil servants. Unlike communists, they promoted modernizing nationalism without class revolution. In February 1930, V and QDD members launched the Yen by uprising, attacking French garrisons. Boldly conceived, it was crushed quickly. Dozens of leaders were executed, hundreds imprisoned. The French response to these movements showed colonial brutality. In the Jit-in Soviet uprising 1930, when a peasant rebellion partly influenced by communist organizing, French planes bombed villages, ground forces did mass executions. Thousands died, ICP networks shattered temporarily, forcing Ho Chi Minh to flee abroad again. By the mid-1930s, with fascism rising in Europe, French policy softened under the Popular Front government. Political prisoners were released, limited Vietnamese language publishing allowed. The ICP seized this chance to rebuild, making legal front groups while keeping a secret revolutionary core. This fragile political dawn of the late 1930s shattered when global conflict reached Vietnam. In 1940, Japanese forces swept into French Indochina. They wanted Asia's resources and their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Unlike other conquered lands, Japan set up an unusual system in Vietnam. They let the French colonial administration handle daily governance, while Japanese troops held strategic positions and resources. This created a nightmare for ordinary Vietnamese, exploited by two imperial powers at once. The Japanese occupation triggered immediate economic change. Rice fields feeding locals were turned to grow rubber-jute and industrial crops for Japan's war machine. Farmers had to sell harvests at artificially low prices. Coal mines and factories were redirected to Japanese military needs. By 1940, for this economic stranglehold plus disrupted transport and bad weather caused catastrophic food shortages in the north. What followed was perhaps the darkest chapter in modern Vietnamese history, the Great Famine of 1940–45. Rice reserves were confiscated, colonial officials failed to bring meaningful relief. Desperate villagers ate bark, leaves, even soil. Whole communities died, corpses lined rural roads. The death toll was staggering. Over 2 million Vietnamese died in less than a year. This created searing memories of colonial neglect that galvanized revolutionary sentiment. Against this suffering, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam in 1941 after 30 years abroad. He set up headquarters in remote caves near the Chinese border. There he transformed the ICP into the Viet Minh United Front. It welcomed nationalists of all political views with one common goal: independence. Unlike earlier resistance, the Viet Minh built a shadow government in northern provinces. They made medical clinics, literacy programs, and people's courts showing viable Vietnamese self-rule. A remarkable twist happened when American intelligence officers parachuted into Viet Minh territory in 1945. OSS agent Archimedes Patty made contact with Ho. He gave radio equipment, weapons, and medical supplies for intelligence on Japanese troops and help rescuing downed American pilots. HO's English skills and pragmatic approach impressed the Americans. They did not know they were helping a leader who would later become their formidable adversary. In March 1945, sensing Allied victory was near, Japan suddenly ended French authority completely. They forced Emperor Bao I to declare Vietnamese independence under Japanese protection. This was a transparent puppet state with little public support. It caused administrative chaos throughout Vietnam as the French colonial system crumbled overnight. The crucial moment came on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Within hours, Ho issued a directive: the decisive hour has struck. The Allied nations have defeated fascist Japan. This is our moment. Advance under the Viet Minh banner and seize power. What followed was remarkably swift and largely bloodless. Village by village, district by district, Viet Minh cadres came from underground and took control. On August 19, Viet Minh forces marched into Hanoi as crowds cheered. Within days, they controlled Hue and persuaded Emperor Bao I to abdicate. By August 25, they took Saigon. This became known as the August Revolution. For the first time in nearly a century, Vietnamese flags flew over government buildings nationwide. The culmination came on September 1945. Before hundreds of thousands in Hanoi SB Aden Square, gaunt but determined Ho Chi Minh approached the microphone. In a moment thick with historical meaning, he declared all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These familiar words, deliberately borrowed from America's founding document, introduced Vietnam's Declaration of Independence. The ink had barely dried on the declaration when the dream of independence hit colonial reality. As celebrations faded in Hanoi, French warships were already nearing Indochina's shores. They were determined to reclaim their jewel of empire. The colonial power, just liberated from Nazi occupation, now sought to deny that same freedom to Vietnam. This was one of history's bitter ironies. By November 1946, negotiations broke down completely. When French warships bombarded Haiphong harbor, killing thousands of civilians, the fragile peace shattered. On December 19, Viet Minh forces struck French positions throughout Hanoi. This marked the official start of the First Indochina War. For nearly 2 months, bitter street fighting engulfed the capital. Then, the Viet Minh tactically withdrew to rural strongholds. They adopted Mao's Adonis idea that the countryside surrounds the city. The conflict became a grueling guerrilla campaign. French forces held major cities and roads by day, but the countryside belonged to the Viet Minh at night. This frustrated traditional French military doctrine. One French officer lamented, "We were waging a 19th century colonial campaign against a 20th century revolutionary army." The Vietnamese resistance perfected appearing and disappearing. They struck vulnerable targets, then melted back into village life or mountain hideouts before retaliation came. Behind this resistance stood General Vo Nguyen Giap, a former history teacher. He became one of the 20th century's greatest military strategists. With no formal training, he developed tactics for Vietnam's terrain situation. His forces built elaborate tunnel networks and camouflaged supply routes, later expanded into the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They mobilized whole villages to support combat. Women and children moved ammunition and supplies, often at night, on bicycles modified to carry hundreds of pounds. The international context shifted dramatically as the Cold War intensified. What began as a colonial conflict became a proxy battle between competing ideologies. In 1950, newly communist China gave substantial material support to the Viet Minh. The United States increasingly bankrolled France's war effort. American policymakers saw Southeast Asia through containment theory. They feared a domino effect if Vietnam fell to communism. By 1953, the war was stalemated. French forces held urban centers in the Red River Delta, but the Viet Minh dominated countryside and mountains. The French public grew disillusioned, with a distant conflict draining resources and lives without clear progress. Seeking decisive victory, French commanders made Operation Castor. They would build a fortress in the remote northwest valley of Dinh Bien Phu near the Laotian border. The French strategy seemed sound in theory. They would make a heavily fortified base supplied only by air. It would cut Viet Minh supply lines to Lors and Lord G. IPS forces into conventional battle. The superior French firepower would win. In November 1953, elite French paratroopers dropped into the valley. They quickly secured the village and an airstrip. What followed showed fatal miscalculations of colonial military thinking. French commanders vastly underestimated GIPS logistical abilities. In an extraordinary feat of human will, tens of thousands of Vietnamese volunteers used bicycles, pack animals, and human strength. They took apart and moved heavy artillery, including 105 howitzers, across seemingly impassable mountain terrain. Women and men carried shells, supplies, and rice on jungle paths, often moving only at night to avoid air detection. By late January 1950, for the trap was reversed. Viet Minh forces now surrounded the French garrison. They had carefully hidden artillery on overlooking hills. On March 13, the first shells hit French positions, starting a siege that lasted 57 days. GIAPS forces cut the airstrip with artillery fire, forcing desperate air-supplied drops. French reinforcements parachuted into a shrinking perimeter under constant bombardment. By early May, monsoon rains turned trenches into muddy graves. The 15,000-strong French force surrendered. Victory at Dien Bien Phu forced France to negotiate. But Vietnam's triumph over colonialism would be bittersweet. While monsoon rains washed away the last traces of French colonial rule, a new, more complex struggle took shape in Geneva. Vietnam had won independence on the battlefield, only to lose it at the conference table. The temporary division at the 17th parallel meant to last just 2 years, instead made to rival Vietnamese states. They were locked in an ideological struggle, consuming the next 2 decades. The Geneva Accords of July 1950 partitioned Vietnam into 2 zones. The North governed by Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary government. The South initially administered by former Emperor Bao Dai. This temporary arrangement was to end with nationwide elections in 1956. A democratic solution would determine the country's future leadership. But the United States, increasingly worried about communism spreading in Southeast Asia, backed Ngo Dinh as Prime Minister in the South. Diem, a strong anti-communist and devout Catholic, quickly consolidated power. In October 1955, he organized a referendum to depose Bao Dai and make himself president of the new Republic of Vietnam. The election had fraud and Saigon Diem got 605,025 votes, though only 450,000 people were registered. With American blessing, Diem refused to join the national elections the Geneva Accords mandated. This cemented Vietnam's division. Diem's government was a stark minority in South Vietnamese society. Catholics were just 10% of the population. Yet they got preferential treatment, government jobs, military promotions, and economic chances. Former Viet Minh supporters faced prison torture and execution under Law 1059. It set up military tribunals for political offences. By 1960, Diem had jailed over 50,000 suspected communists and political opponents. In the countryside, Diem's land policies reversed Viet Minh redistribution. They gave property back to large landowners, forcing peasants to pay back rent for years they had farmed land under revolutionary rule. The Agroville program later expanded into the Strategic Hamlet program, forcibly moved rural villages into fortified settlements. These were surrounded by moats, barbed wire, and bamboo spikes. The moves separated farmers from ancestral lands and family graves, sacred connections in Vietnamese culture. One peasant told an American observer, "They make us leave our homes, our gardens, the tombs of our ancestors. They won't let us go back to our villages, even to look for leftover rice." In response, former Viet Minh cadres, who stayed in the South after partition, began organizing resistance. On December 20, 1960, the National Liberation Front was formed. It united various anti-Diem groups under one banner. While claiming independence publicly, the NLF got direction and supplies from North Vietnam through the growing Ho Chi Minh Trail network. American involvement deepened steadily. President Kennedy increased military advisors from 900 to over 16,000 between 1961 and 1963. U.S. Special Forces trained South Vietnamese troops. CIA worked with Montagnard ethnic minorities in the Central Highlands. American aid funded nearly 80% of South Vietnam's military budget. It paid for the Diem regime's increasingly unpopular policies. The crisis peaked in 1963 when Diem and Buddhist flags during Vesak celebrations. He allowed Catholic banners for a church anniversary at the same time. Widespread Buddhist protests erupted. Government forces fired on demonstrators in Hue, killing 9. Protests escalated when 73-year-old monk Thich Quang Duc sat in meditation at a busy Saigon intersection on June 11. He let fellow monks pour gasoline on him and set himself on fire. As he burned without crying out, journalist David Halberstam wrote, "I was too shocked to cry, too confused to take notes or ask questions, too bewildered to even think." Diem's response, raiding pagodas and arresting hundreds of monks, fueled more resistance. With American officials increasingly frustrated by his leadership, South Vietnamese generals got tacit U.S. approval for a coup. On November 1, 1963, military forces overthrew the government. Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh were killed the next day, despite American assurances of safe passage. 21 days after Diem's assassination, President Kennedy himself was killed. This grim coincidence marked the start of America's darkest chapter in Southeast Asia. What followed became one of history's most and metric conflicts. The world's wealthiest superpower used unprecedented technological might against a mainly agrarian society that refused to surrender its independence. South Vietnam's post-Diem leadership was chaotic. 9 separate governments came in just 18 months. This instability let the Viet Cong expand control over rural areas. By 1965, facing South Vietnam's possible collapse, President Lyndon Johnson abandoned the limited advisory role. He committed American ground forces to the conflict. Within months, over 200,000 American troops were deployed. By 1968, that number swelled to over 500,000. Americans brought overwhelming firepower. B-52 bombers carpet-bombed suspected enemy areas. Helicopter gunships strafed jungle canopies. Chemical defouling stripped away vegetation hiding their enemy. Operation Rolling Thunder alone dropped more bombs on North Vietnam between 1965 and 1968 than fell on all of Europe in World War II. Agent Orange destroyed millions of acres of forest and farmland. It devastated ecosystems and caused birth defects, and cons was lasting to this day. Against this technological onslaught, North Vietnamese forces and Southern allies used patience, adaptability, and intimate knowledge of terrain. The Cu Kai Tunnel complex near Saigon showed this approach. It was a 250-kilometer labyrinth of underground passages. It held hospitals, storage facilities, and command centers, sometimes right under American bases. American soldiers, called tunnel rats, had to crawl through these tight spaces. They had only a pistol and flashlight, facing booby traps and enemy fighters in pitch dark. The war's pivotal moment came in January 1968 during Lunar New Year Tet. While American commanders thought they were winning a war of attrition, communist forces launched coordinated attacks. They hit over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. The Tet offensive caught U.S. forces completely by surprise. Particularly shocking was the assault on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, America's symbolic fortress in Vietnam. Guerrillas briefly got in before being killed or captured. Though the offensive failed militarily, with communist forces suffering heavy losses, the psychological impact was profound. CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, went to Vietnam and told viewers, "It seems now more certain than ever the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." Cronkite's assessment showed growing disillusionment at home. Anti-war protests became more mainstream. The human toll mounted relentlessly. In March 1968, U.S. soldiers massacred over 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians in My Live village. Victims included women, children, and the elderly. Though covered up, at first the atrocity eventually became public. It intensified moral questions about the war. Meanwhile, civilian casualties from bombing, artillery, and crossfire reached hundreds of thousands. Millions of Vietnamese became refugees in their own country. They went to squalid camps or strategic hamlets were destroyed and rebuilt. By 1960, newly elected President Richard Nixon sought a way out while avoiding looking defeated. His Vietnamization policy aimed to gradually give combat duties to South Vietnamese forces as U.S. troops withdrew. At the same time, Nixon expanded the war geographically. He launched secret bombing campaigns against Cambodia and Laos to disrupt supply routes. The Paris Peace Accord, signed in January 1973, formally ended direct U.S. military involvement. American prisoners of war came home to a nation deeply divided by the conflict. South Vietnam, now dependent on American aid, not troops, struggled to contain communist advances. When Congress cut military assistance in 1974-75, the end came quickly. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The last Americans evacuated by helicopter from the embassy roof. Iconic images showed a superpower in retreat. South Vietnam's final president, Duong Van Minh, announced unconditional surrender. After decades of division, Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. Vietnamese for thousand-year journey is one of resilience, unity, and transformation. From myths to modernity, it is a story of adapting, enduring, and staying fiercely independent. And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered and some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening, and until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.